welcome back to the deep dive. We spend a lot of time on this show trying to make sense of the headlines. We look at the summits, the handshakes, the press releases, and usually we try to find the logic in them. We try to parse the strategy from the statement. But today,
No, today is different.
today we are doing something fundamentally different.
Very different, because the source material we are working with today suggests that looking for logic in the headlines is, well, it's a trap. It suggests that what we are seeing on the surface, the diplomacy, the concern expressed by leaders, the endless cycles of peace talks,
It's all just a show.
it's essentially a play, a performance.
The theater of the absurd. That is the phrase that keeps coming up in the documents we've been reviewing. It's such a heavy concept.
It is.
It implies that the actors know they're acting,
Yeah.
and the audience knows it's a play, but everyone just keeps clapping anyway.
Precisely. And what we are going to do today is step off the stage. We are going to go backstage into the machine room where the actual levers of power are being pulled.
And we are doing that by deep diving into a comprehensive, and I have to say, frankly, quite disturbing assessment by Scott Ritter.
Yes. And before we get into the details, and believe me, there are a lot of details here, we should probably frame who Ritter is in this context, because people hear the name and they have a reaction. He is, without a doubt, a polarizing figure.
He is, but for the purpose of this deep dive, we are stripping away the personality and looking at the resume. We are looking at him as a technician.
That's the key. He's a former Marine Corps intelligence officer. He was a UN weapons inspector in Iraq. He understands the mechanics of how states project power.
Right.
He isn't looking at what politicians say. He's looking at where the ammo is moving. He's looking at logistics, targeting data, and force deployment, the nuts and bolts of war.
And that's the red pill aspect of this whole discussion. We are ignoring the rhetoric and watching the logistics. And Ritter's thesis here, looking specifically at the direction of U.S. foreign policy, particularly under a potential Trump administration with figures like Marco Rubio and J.D. Vance, is that it's not pivoting toward peace.
Not at all.
It's pivoting toward a kind of aggressive dominance that relies on three pillars.
Three very unstable, very dangerous pillars.
Exactly. The first is the total subjugation of Europe. Not a partnership, subjugation.
Right.
The second is a calculated path to war with Iran, which he calls the Geneva trap.
Yeah.
And the third is the dismantling of the entire multipolar world order, specifically the BRICS alliance.
And it sounds like a grand conspiracy theory when you just list it like that.
It does. It sounds huge.
But then you start looking at the specific data points he highlights. When you look at the TPFDD, the deployment data we'll get into, or the forensic analysis of drone wreckage, it stops being a theory.
It starts looking like a blueprint.
It really does.
Okay, so let's start with Pillar 1, Europe, the old world. If you watched the recent Munich Security Conference, the headlines were all about unity, transatlantic resolve,
Ironclad bonds, all the usual phrases.
all the buzzwords. But Ritter watched the same conference and saw something completely different. He saw a circus.
A circus where the performers didn't realize they were the joke. You have to understand the history of Munich. This used to be the serious place.
It had a certain gravity.
Immense gravity. This was where the Cold War architecture was managed. It was somber. It was technical. You went there to prevent nuclear war. Now, Ritter describes it as an applause factory.
An applause factory. It's interesting you say that because the images that come out of Munich, they always look very serious. Men in dark suits, flags, grand podiums. But you're saying Ritter's arguing the substance has just evaporated.
Completely. He argues that the format has shifted from problem solving to posturing. It's a venue for gotcha moments and sound bites.
Sound bites for who?
For domestic audiences back home, not for the people in the room. And the centerpiece of this specific analysis was Marco Rubio's speech.
Okay, right. Marco Rubio. And the context here is crucial. Europe has been, for lack of a better word, panicking.
Terrified.
They've been hearing the America First rhetoric, the threats about NATO funding, and they're just terrified that the U.S. is going to abandon them.
So they were looking to Rubio for reassurance.
Exactly. They wanted a pat on the head. They wanted to hear, don't worry, we are still equal partners. Everything's going to be okay.
They were desperate for validation. And did they get it? Well, they thought they got it.
They gave him a standing ovation.
They did. But Ritter argues that if you actually parse Rubio's sentences, if you look at the syntax and the demands buried in the rhetoric, he wasn't offering partnership at all.
What was he offering?
He was offering a job description.
A job description.
Yes. And the job title is subordinate. Subordinate, that's a strong word. Subordinate in what way? Because the official line is always the transatlantic alliance. That implies a level, horizontal playing field.
Ritter argues that the field has been tilted vertically. He says that "Make America Great Again" in the current iteration of U.S. foreign policy actually translates to "Make America Dominant Globally Again."
And to be dominant globally.
You can't have peers. You can't have partners who can say no. You need facilitators.
So Europe's role is to facilitate.
To facilitate and to project. Ritter's analysis is that the U.S. views Europe now not as a collaborator to consult with, but as a launch pad. Europe is there to hold the coat while America gets in the fight, specifically in the global south.
So it's a return to a colonial mindset.
It is, but this time, Europe isn't the colonial power, it's the deputy.
That is a massive demotion. I mean, from leader of the free world alongside the U.S. to, well, to the help.
It is. And Ritter uses a metaphor here that is, well, it's incredibly blunt. It's jarring.
But we have to discuss it because it perfectly encapsulates the dynamic he describes. And I want to be clear, this is Ritter's language, not ours.
Understood. Go ahead. What's the metaphor?
He compares the U.S.-Europe relationship to a high-priced hooker versus a cheap trick.
Wow, okay. That is vivid.
Yeah.
And undeniably harsh. Let's unpack why he would use that specific imagery. What point is he trying to make with something that inflammatory?
He's trying to shock the listener into seeing the purely transactional nature of the relationship. He's saying that for decades, the NATO alliance was sold to Europe as a romance.
A marriage.
A marriage. We share values, we live together in a house of democracy. But in reality, Ritter argues the U.S. was treating Europe like a high-end escort.
How so?
You put them up in a nice hotel, that's the Marshall Plan, the security umbrella. You buy them nice things, but you don't actually let them move into the family home. You don't let them make decisions about the family bank account.
So it's always transactional, but at least the transaction was lucrative for Europe. They got something out of it.
Exactly. They got security and economic access. It was a good deal for them. But now, the money is tight, the geopolitical situation is rough, and Ritter says the U.S. has stopped paying for the nice hotel.
They've downgraded.
They've realized they don't need to woo Europe anymore. Europe has nowhere else to go. They've cut off their cheap energy from Russia. They've alienated China. They are totally 100% dependent on the U.S. security umbrella.
So because they have no other options, the U.S. can treat them
like a cheap trick. Used when needed, discarded when not, and told to disappear until the U.S. feels an itch that needs scratching.
My God.
It implies a complete lack of respect and a complete lack of agency on Europe's part. It's brutal.
That paints a picture of a relationship that is entirely one-sided. It makes European leaders look, well, pathetic. If this analysis holds any water, why do they accept it? Why do they stand up and applaud Marco Rubio?
Ritter has a term for that, too. He calls it abused wife syndrome.
Another heavy metaphor.
It is, but look at the evidence he presents. He points to the history of surveillance. We know, it's a fact, it's not a theory, that the U.S. National Security Agency, the NSA, spied on Angela Merkel's private phone.
I remember that. It was a huge scandal for about a week. Everyone was outraged.
And then what happened?
Nothing. It went away.
It just went away, exactly. And Ritter mentions a deeper layer to this, which I found fascinating. He discusses how the Dutch intelligence services allowed the U.S. to spy on French telecommunications.
So they were spying on their own EU partner for the U.S.
Yes, and he asks this rhetorical question, Daddy's coming to ask you to spy on your sister. What kind of family is that?
It's a dysfunctional one, to say the least.
But the reaction, or the lack of reaction, is what fascinates Ritter. A normal sovereign country would be furious. They would expel diplomats, they would tear up treaties, they would demand guarantees.
And Europe?
They applauded Rubio. They're cheering for their own irrelevance. Ritter's conclusion is that Europe has become a spectator to its own marginalization. They are standing ovation-giving observers.
So, if we accept this first pillar, that Europe is neutralized, compliant, and effectively a staging ground rather than a player, that clears the board.
It does.
It clears the board for the U.S. to focus on its actual adversaries, which means we have to pivot to the east. Let's talk about Russia.
The Russia file. This is where the theater of the absurd gets deadly serious.
Right, because while the diplomats are posturing in Munich, there is a very hot, very kinetic war happening in Ukraine. And Ritter's take is that the diplomacy regarding this war is, for all intents and purposes, dead.
Completely dead.
Yeah.
He uses this shorthand. He refers to the Anchorage concept.
Anchorage. Like the city in Alaska. I don't understand the reference.
Yes, the city. It's a reference to a specific diplomatic opportunity, what could have been. It's shorthand for a moment in the past where Russia felt it had laid everything on the table.
A missed chance.
A huge one. Ritter explains that the Russians feel they made very difficult concessions, and this is language that Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, has used publicly. They believed they met the U.S. conditions for peace. They were ready to sign a deal.
Okay, so what happened?
According to Ritter, the U.S. immediately watered down the deal. They added new conditions. They diluted the security guarantees that were at the core of the whole thing.
They moved the goalposts.
They moved the goalposts. And to the Russians, that signaled that the U.S. isn't serious. It never was. Ritter says the Russians have now realized that Alaska was a lie. The idea of a fair negotiated settlement was a lie.
So once you realize the goalposts are on wheels, you stop kicking the ball.
Exactly. You pick up the ball and you walk off the field. So now the war will not be resolved by diplomats in suits. It will be resolved by military technical means.
Which is a very polite, very sanitized way of saying brute force, logistics, and destruction.
Correct. And Ritter paints a grim picture of the situation on the ground. He talks about the near-total destruction of Ukraine's energy infrastructure. It's not just damaged, it's gone.
And the plan to just keep feeding weapons in.
He argues that the British plan, which was to keep Ukraine fighting indefinitely through these minor tactical escalations, has failed. But here is where it gets really interesting and, frankly, terrifying.
Okay.
The U.S. claims it is stepping back, right? You hear Trump and Vance talking about ending the war, cutting funding, but Ritter says the U.S. is actually deeply, directly involved in the targeting.
You mentioned a specific incident involving a chip. This felt like something out of a techno thriller. Can you tell us about that?
This is a fascinating detail that just hasn't made mainstream headlines. Apparently, there was a failed drone strike intended to hit near the Russian president's residence.
An assassination attempt.
Or at least an act of extreme intimidation. 91 drones were supposed to hit.
91 drones. That's not a strike, that's a swarm.
A massive swarm. But it failed. Russian electronic warfare brought them down, or they malfunctioned. The key is the Russians recovered the wreckage. And inside one of the drones, a fixed-wing type, likely a Mugen 5 Pro or a similar commercial frame that's been converted for military use, they found a guidance chip.
Now, when you say a chip, are we talking about something you could pull out of a washing machine? Or something more advanced?
No, this is highly specialized. A guidance and navigation component. And the Russians didn't just look at the serial number. They performed a deep forensic digital analysis. They traced the data logs on that chip. And those logs pointed directly to U.S. Department of Defense intelligence stations in Europe.
Wait a minute. So you're saying they have the digital fingerprint showing that the targeting data, the coordinates for the strike, came from a U.S. base?
They have the smoking gun. The implication is that the U.S. is directly providing the targeting packages. When a Storm Shadow missile or an ATAS-CMS missile is launched, or one of these long-range drones built in Germany is deployed, they are not flying on Ukrainian math.
They're flying on American intelligence.
They are flying on coordinates provided by American intelligence, likely filtered through advanced data integration systems like Palantir.
That changes the whole complexion of a proxy war. That's direct involvement. If you hold the gun and I aim it for you, we're both shooting.
It removes any pretense of separation, and Ritter says the Russians know this. And in a classic intelligence community power move, they returned the chip to the U.S.
They gave it back.
They sent it back to the U.S. representatives. It's a message. It's saying, we didn't just find this. We know what it is. We know where it came from. We know you did it. Here is your property back.
That is a chilling message. It's essentially a warning. We see you.
And it explains why the diplomatic channels are completely frozen. Why would Russia negotiate with a diplomat when they believe the intelligence agencies of that same country are trying to kill their leadership?
Good point.
Ritter contrasts the personnel involved to highlight this disconnect. On the Russian side, you have a figure like Vladimir Medinsky.
Who is he? I've heard the name, but he's usually in the background of photos.
He's often dismissed in the West as just a historian or a culture minister. But Ritter corrects this record. He says Medinsky is a very serious figure, a deeply trusted advisor to Putin, maybe even a successor candidate.
A heavyweight.
An intellectual heavyweight. He's there to talk brass tacks about history, security architecture, the foundational issues.
And who is he up against? Who is on the other side of the table?
Ritter points to Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General. And Ritter is, well, he is not kind to Rutte.
I'm sensing a theme.
He dismisses him as a failed leader, a politician who couldn't hold his own government together in the Netherlands and sort of failed upwards into the NATO job.
Yeah.
The contrast in seriousness is palpable. You have an intellectual strategist versus a career politician managing a PR crisis.
What about the economic side of things? We've heard about back channels, businessmen trying to cut deals. There was a lot of talk about a figure named Kirill Dmitriev.
Ah, yes. The Kirill Dmitriev experiment. This is crucial for understanding why the deal isn't happening and why people like Trump and Vance are misreading the situation.
Okay, so who is he?
Dmitriev is an economic whiz kid, head of the Russian Direct Investment Fund. He's an outsider, Western-educated, Harvard MBA, speaks the language of Wall Street and Davos.
So he's the guy you send to talk to New York and London.
Exactly. And there was this theory in the West that maybe there was a split in the Kremlin, that Dmitriev represented a liberal faction that wanted to make a deal with the U.S., and that he was at odds with the hardliners in the security services, the Siloviki.
And Ritter says that's false.
He says it's a fundamental misunderstanding of how Russia works under Putin. Dmitriev wasn't a split. He was a probe, an experiment.
A probe.
Yes. Putin is a pragmatist. He allowed Dmitriev to try his channel, to meet with people like Jared Kushner or the real estate developer Steve Witkoff. He basically said, okay, you think there's a deal to be made, go see what they have to offer.
And what did they offer?
Subjugation, essentially. Ritter's analysis is that the U.S. conditions for investment and normalization were always predicated on changes in Russian governance that would reduce sovereignty. Basically, we will invest, but you have to let us control the rules of your economy.
Which Russia, especially now, is never going to accept.
Never. So Dmitriev wasn't a rival power center. He was an experiment. And that experiment failed. Ritter says the Kirill Dmitriev experiment is over, which means the deal that Trump or Vance talks about where Russia just stops fighting and everyone goes home, it's completely disconnected from reality.
Why?
Because Russia has no incentive to stop. Their conditions have hardened. They believe they're winning the logistics war, the war of attrition, and they know the U.S. is trying to kill them with the chip war. So the idea of a simple peace deal is just, it's a fantasy.
Okay, so let's pause and look at the map we've drawn so far. Europe is subjugated. Russia is locked in a war that will only end militarily. Now let's move south to the Middle East. Because if you thought the Ukraine situation was tense, Ritter's analysis of Iran is, well, it sounds like the plot of a Hollywood blockbuster.
This is the Geneva trap. And this is where we need to get technical about how wars actually start. Not the political decision, but the mechanical process.
Right, because we see headlines about talks in Geneva. We think, oh, good, they're talking. Diplomacy is working. Ritter says, don't believe it for a second.
He says the U.S. is not seeking a nuclear deal. The U.S. is not seeking peace with Iran. The stated, and he stresses this, the stated policy is regime change.
Regime change. Okay, so why go to Geneva? Why sit at the table and drink coffee if you ultimately plan to overthrow the government?
To buy time. Ritter calls it a 2-week window of immunity.
Immunity for who? And from what?
Immunity for the United States military. Here is the backstory he lays out. In January, tensions were sky high. There was a moment where the U.S. leadership wanted to strike. But the military brass, the Pentagon general, said, Bach, we can't do it. We're not ready.
Why not? I mean, we have the most powerful military in the world. We spend nearly $1 trillion a year. What do you mean we can't do it?
We couldn't do it safely. The generals looked at the map and saw a huge vulnerability. They knew that if the U.S. launched a major strike, Iran would retaliate immediately.
No.
They would rain ballistic missiles down on Tel Aviv, on Haifa, on the Saudi oil fields, and crucially, on U.S. bases throughout the region. The U.S. Missile Defense Shield, the Patriot batteries, the THAAD systems. It just wasn't dense enough to stop that kind of swarm.
So it would have been a bloodbath. The U.S. would have taken massive casualties, and our allies would have been devastated.
It would have been a catastrophe, an unacceptable price.
Yeah.
So the military said, we need a timeout, we need to reset the deck, and that, according to Ritter, is what the Geneva talks.
The timeout.
They aren't about finding a diplomatic solution. They are a stall tactic. They are designed to keep the Iranians talking and calm for just a few weeks while the U.S. moves the chess pieces on the board.
And this brings us to a military acronym that Ritter obsesses over. It sounds incredibly boring, but he says it's the key to everything.
TPFDD.
TPFDD, or as it's known in the military, tip fiddle.
Tip fiddle.
It stands for time-phased force and deployment data.
It sounds like the most boring bureaucratic term imaginable.
It's designed to sound boring, but it is the master clock of war. Ritter knows this because he helped build these schedules for the invasion of Iraq in Desert Storm. The TPFDD isn't just a list of stuff. It's a mathematical formula for inevitability.
Explain that. How does a spreadsheet make war inevitable?
Think of it like a massive global conveyor belt. You have fuel tankers, ammunition ships, sustainment gear, spare parts for aircraft, hospital ships. Moving this stuff requires chartering the global merchant marine. It requires calling up reserves. It costs billions and billions of dollars just to start the engine. Okay, so it's expensive. I get that.
It's not just the money, it's the momentum. Ritter explains that there is a point of no return in a TPFDD schedule. Once you have moved, say, 60% of your sustainment fleet into the theater of operations, you cannot just turn them around and send them home.
Why not?
The political cost of spending that money and disrupting global shipping for nothing is too high. No president wants to look like they mobilized the entire military for a fake-out. The political pressure to use the force you've assembled becomes overwhelming.
So once a TPFDD crosses a certain line, the war has effectively started, even if the shooting hasn't.
Exactly. The logistics dictate the policy. And Ritter is watching the shipping manifest right now. He sees the fleet replenishment oilers moving into position. He sees the Aegis Ashore systems being calibrated. He sees the missile defense density increasing around Israel and Saudi Arabia.
He calls it a window of invulnerability.
That's the goal. The U.S. wants to get to a position where they can launch their air campaign against Iran, and when Iran tries to fire back, the U.S. can simply swat the missiles out of the sky. Once that shield is up,
The talks in Geneva will end.
abruptly, the green light is on.
And what does this war look like in his scenario? Are we talking boots on the ground? Another Iraq-style occupation?
No. Ritter is very, very clear on this. It is not an occupation. The U.S. has no appetite for occupying Tehran. It is an air campaign, a massive bombardment designed to retard Iran's ballistic missile capabilities.
But that doesn't achieve regime change.
No, it doesn't. Because the real war is happening on the ground, but not with American soldiers. It's happening with something called digital democracy.
Digital democracy. That sounds nice. It sounds positive, like voting apps or something.
It sounds benign, doesn't it? But Ritter connects it to a concept developed by Jared Cohen.
Jared Cohen. The name sounds familiar.
He was a key figure at Google Ideas, which is now called Jigsaw, and before that he served in the State Department under both Hillary Clinton and Condoleezza Rice. He literally wrote the book on using connectivity, the internet, social media, to bypass authoritarian control and infect minds with Western narratives.
So basically, weaponizing the internet to start a revolution.
Precisely. And this brings us to Starlink, Elon Musk's satellite internet.
The Starlink factor. This seems to be popping up in every conflict zone.
It's a game changer. The U.S. State Department has publicly admitted to sending about 7,000 Starlink terminals into Iran to help protesters communicate.
Okay, 7,000. That's a lot. But is it enough to start a revolution?
Ritter claims the real number is over 100,000.
100,000. How do you even smuggle 100,000 satellite terminals into a country like Iran?
Over time. Through the Kurdish border in the northwest, via Baluchistan in the southeast, it's a massive clandestine operation. But the technology is the key here. You might ask, can't the Iranians just detect the signal and jam it?
That would be my first thought. If I'm the Iranian government, I just scan for the Starlink frequency and blast it with noise.
And you could do that with a standard terminal. But Ritter says that Mossad Israeli intelligence has modified these specific terminals. They've equipped them with military-grade frequency hopping capabilities.
Frequency hopping. Explain the physics of that for us. What does that actually do?
Okay, so a jammer normally works by flooding a specific radio frequency with noise. It's like screaming in a room so no one can hear a whisper on a particular note. Frequency hopping means the whisper jumps from one channel, one note to another, thousands of times a second in a prearranged pseudo-random pattern.
So the jammer doesn't know where the signal is going to be next.
Well, exactly. Unless you can scream on every channel at once, which takes an enormous amount of power and is practically impossible, you can't stop the message. It makes them invisible to standard detection and jamming.
So the strategic goal is to build a shadow communications network inside Iran.
A resilient, unjammable shadow network. So even if the Iranian government hits the kill switch on the national internet, which they have done before during protests, these 100,000 nodes stay live.
So they can coordinate?
They can coordinate uprisings, they can spread information or disinformation. And Ritter describes the regime change script. He calls it the ISIS model.
The ISIS model. That's a terrifying comparison.
It is, but look at the mechanics, not the ideology. Think back to when ISIS took over Mosul in Iraq. Did they have a massive army of 50,000 men to occupy the city? No.
I had a few thousand at most, right?
Right. They had small groups of militants in white pickup trucks. They raced through the streets, firing their guns into the air. They captured key intersections. They posted videos online claiming they had already won, that the army had fled.
It was psychological warfare, performance art almost.
It was. They created the perception of total collapse. They terrified the population into staying home. They made it look like the government was gone. Ritter predicts the plan for Iran is very similar.
How so?
Use the U.S. air campaign to suppress the Iranian military, and police keep them pinned down in their barracks, afraid to move. Then activate these sleeper cells that are already in the country groups like the Kurdish Pij, Baluch militants, the MEK.
And have them roll into the streets in white pickup trucks.
Create chaos. Create the perception of collapse. The passive majority of the population stays inside because they are scared of the bombs from above and the gunmen on the streets. The government is declared dead on the Starlink network. And then the U.S. and its allies install a new government. Ritter explicitly mentions the Jared Kushner connection again here. He suggests there is a prepackaged plan to install a hand-picked, friendly government once the Islamic Republic is toppled.
That is a staggering level of ambition, to think you can just swap out the government of a country of 80 million people.
It is a massive, massive gamble. Ritter calls it insanity. He thinks it fundamentally underestimates the Iranian people and the state's resilience, but he insists the political decision has essentially been made. The military movements, the tip fiddle, tell the real story. The diplomacy is just the distraction while the pieces move into place.
So we have Europe neutralized. We have a war brewing in Iran based on deception. But this isn't just about regional conflicts. Ritter connects all of this to the big one, the global structure. BRICS.
This is the why. This is the grand strategy behind it all. Why is the U.S. doing this? Why risk a massive war with Iran? Ritter argues that the overarching goal of this particular foreign policy outlook is to dismantle BRICS to maintain U.S. hegemony.
BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now the new members, the counterweight to the G7. The so-called Global South Alliance.
Correct. And Ritter sees a strategy to pick off the weak letters.
The weak letters, what does that mean?
Look at the acronym, BRICS. Ritter says B is vulnerable. Brazil, it's in the Western Hemisphere. It's under the shadow of the Monroe Doctrine. The U.S. can exert massive economic and political pressure there to flip them or neutralize them.
Okay, so B is fragile.
S is vulnerable, South Africa. Isolated geographically at the tip of the continent, facing its own internal struggles, also susceptible to pressure.
So if you knock out Brazil and South Africa,
you are left with RIC. Russia, India, China. You have isolated the core. You've stripped away their global reach.
And you've broken the narrative of a world alliance against the West.
Exactly. And this leads to the ultimate target, China. Ritter issues a very specific warning regarding the connection between Iran and China. He says Beijing is watching this very, very closely.
What's the connection? Why does the fall of Iran matter so much to Beijing?
Because of Taiwan. Ritter argues that the one China policy, the delicate, decades-old diplomatic fiction that keeps the peace in the Taiwan Strait, is on the chopping block.
He thinks the U.S. will abandon it.
He says if the U.S. succeeds in toppling Iran, they will feel invincible. They will have momentum. And the very next move will be to make Taiwan a hard checkmate on China's border.
Meaning abandoning the one China policy entirely.
Yes. Recognizing Taiwan as an independent nation, fortifying it, using it as an unsinkable aircraft carrier right off the Chinese coast. Ritter suggests that if Iran falls, the U.S. will believe it has the strategic depth and the momentum to challenge China directly over its most sensitive issue.
So Ritter is essentially giving advice to America's adversaries here. He's laying out their playbook and telling them what they should do in response.
He is. And it's the most controversial part of his analysis. He is calling for preemption.
Preemption, as in strike first.
Yes. He references a very old case in international law, the Caroline Affair.
The Caroline Affair. That sounds like a period drama, not a military strategy.
It's actually a foundational case from 1837. It involved a steamboat, Canadian rebels, and the British Royal Navy. But the legal principle it established is absolutely vital today. The principle of anticipatory self-defense.
Anticipatory self-defense.
It basically says you don't have to wait until the knife is actually in your chest to fight back. If you see your enemy sharpening the knife, telling everyone in the town square he's going to stab you, and then starts walking toward you with the knife raised, you have the right to strike him first.
So Ritter is telling Iran to invoke the Caroline principle, to claim anticipatory self-defense.
He suggests Iran should invoke Article 51 of the UN Charter, which covers self-defense, and strike the U.S. military buildup before it becomes an overwhelming existential threat, before that window of invulnerability is closed.
He's telling them to attack U.S. forces.
He's saying, if you wait for the TPFDD to complete, you die. That's his logic. He's telling them to define a red line. Stop moving these ships, stop moving these missiles into position, or we will assume you intend to kill us and we will fire first.
That is an incredibly dangerous piece of advice.
It is. But he's telling China the same thing. He argues China needs to draw a red line that says an attack on Iran forces us to rethink our stance on Taiwan, because if they don't, Taiwan is absolutely next on the agenda.
He calls it the duck test.
Right. It's a classic intelligence saying, if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and quacks like a duck.
It's a duck.
Stop pretending it's diplomacy. Call it a duck. It's a war preparation, and act accordingly.
This is heavy. It's a lot to process. We've gone from a speech at a conference in Munich to a guidance chip in a drone to 100,000 smuggled Starlink terminals to a global war for the future of BRICS.
It is the definition of a deep dive. We are seeing the connective tissue between events that seem completely unrelated on the evening news.
So let's try to synthesize this for a moment. We've covered the three pillars. Europe is the subordinate launch pad. Iran is the trap being set. BRICS is the ultimate target. What is the takeaway for the listener? Why should you at home care about TPFDD or a chip in a drone?
Because we are living in that theater of the absurd. The takeaway is that public statements, what you hear from the White House or Downing Street or the Elysee Palace, are often the exact opposite of the military reality. The spin is one way, the logistics are another.
And the risk of miscalculation is huge.
Higher than it has been in decades. We are talking about the global energy supply. We are talking about the internet itself being used as a weapon of regime change. The stakes are immense.
And if Ritter is right, the machine is already in motion. The political decision for war with Iran has, in his view, already been made.
That is the most chilling part of his entire analysis. The idea that we are all just waiting for the logistics to catch up to the decision. That spreadsheets are dictating the fate of the world.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for everyone to consider. If Ritter is correct, and the U.S. launches this air campaign against Iran, what happens when the first missile flies?
That is the question, isn't it? Does the world passively watch, like Europe at the Munich Security Conference, applauding its own subjugation? Or does this trigger the global fracture he predicts?
Does China intervene? Does Russia open a new front?
Does the cheap trick suddenly become the spark that burns down the whole house?
We are watching the logistics. Because, as Ritter says, politicians lie, but the movement of ships and ammo tells the truth.
Always watch the ammo.
That's it for this deep dive. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and keep your eyes on the horizon.
Indeed. Until next time.